He had witnessed every kind of talent imaginable, but when this young man stepped onto the stage and began conducting music only he could feel, Simon Cowell realized he was about to learn what it truly means to hear with your heart. The America's Got Talent Theater buzzed with its familiar electric energy, the kind of charged atmosphere that came from hundreds of dreams converging under bright lights and rolling cameras. The judges sat in their customary positions, Simon Cowell's sharp profile cutting against the dramatic lighting as he maintained that trademark expression of focused attention that had become his signature over decades of evaluating hopeful performers. Tonight felt routine in the best possible way. The production schedule was flowing smoothly, the acts had provided compelling entertainment, and the audience was engaged and responsive to the variety of talent crossing the stage. Simon reviewed his notes, tracking the evening's rhythm and mentally preparing for the final acts that would round out another successful night of auditions. But in the wings, where anticipation and terror mingled in equal measure, something extraordinary was preparing to unfold. Something that would challenge every assumption Simon had ever made about music, performance, and the fundamental nature of how human beings connect with sound and rhythm. His name was Alex Rivera, 16 years old, and he was wearing a simple black suit that his mother had bought him specifically for this audition. In his hands, he carried a conductor's baton that looked almost comically large for someone so young, but which he held with the confidence and precision of someone who had spent years learning to command invisible orchestras. Alex had been born into a world of absolute silence, not the peaceful quiet that hearing people sometimes crave, but a complete absence of auditory experience that had shaped every moment of his conscious existence. He had never heard his mother's lullabies, never startled at unexpected sounds, never experienced the simple pleasure of humming along to a favorite song. But Alex had been born with something else, an extraordinary sensitivity to vibration, rhythm, and the visual patterns that music creates when it moves through air and space. From his earliest childhood, he had been drawn to situations where live music was performed, not because he could hear it, but because he could feel it in ways that went beyond the conventional experience of sound. His mother, Carmen Rivera, had noticed Alex's unusual responses to musical environments when he was just 2 years old. While other deaf children might ignore live performances, Alex would become transfixed, his small hands moving in patterns that seemed to mirror the musicians he was watching. When Carmen played classical recordings with the volume turned high enough to create vibrations through the floor and furniture, Alex would position himself to feel the bass lines through his body and respond with movements that showed sophisticated understanding of rhythm and musical structure. Carmen had initially assumed this was simply Alex's way of engaging with an environment he couldn't fully access. But as Alex grew older, his responses became more complex, more intentional, more clearly connected to specific musical elements that he was somehow perceiving, despite his deafness. By age 5, Alex was conducting, along with classical recordings, his arm movements showing an intuitive understanding of musical phrasing, dynamics, and the relationship between different instrumental sections. Carmen watched in amazement as her son seemed to anticipate musical changes, his conducting gestures shifting in preparation for crescendos, transitions, and climactic moments that he had no auditory way of predicting. When Carmen consulted with specialists in deaf education and music therapy, she learned about the concept of vibrational music perception. Some profoundly deaf individuals, they explained, could develop extraordinary sensitivity to the physical properties of sound waves, feeling bass frequencies through their bodies, detecting rhythmic patterns through vibrations, even sensing melodic movement through changes in air pressure and visual observation of musicians' movements. But Alex's abilities went far beyond typical vibrational perception. He seemed to be experiencing something closer to synesthesia, a neurological phenomenon where one sense translates information typically processed by another sense. For Alex, musical vibrations appeared to create visual patterns in his mind, allowing him to see symphonies in ways that were completely foreign to hearing musicians. Dr. Sarah Chen, a researcher studying musical perception in deaf individuals, began working with Alex when he was 7 years old. Her initial assessments revealed capabilities that challenge conventional understanding of how musical knowledge develops. Alex can identify specific instruments by their vibrational signatures, Dr. Chen had explained to Carmen during one of their early sessions. He can distinguish between a violin and a viola, based solely on how their sound waves feel against his chest and arms. He can detect changes in tempo that are so subtle most hearing musicians would miss them. But even more remarkably, Alex had begun developing his own system for translating his vibrational perceptions into conducting gestures. He would watch videos of famous conductors leading orchestras, studying their movements and somehow correlating those visual cues with the vibrational patterns he was feeling from the recorded music. By age 10, Alex was conducting along with complex classical pieces with accuracy that stunned music professionals. His movements weren't mimicry or memorized choreography. They were genuine musical interpretation, showing understanding of orchestral balance, instrumental entries, and expressive phrasing that typically took years of formal training to develop. Carmen had enrolled Alex in conducting lessons with Professor Maria Gonzalez at the local conservatory, despite initial skepticism from administrators who questioned whether a deaf student could meaningfully participate in orchestral training. Professor Gonzalez quickly discovered that Alex's unconventional pathway to musical understanding had given him insights that many hearing conducting students struggled to achieve. Alex understands rhythm in his bones, Professor Gonzalez had told Carmen after Alex's first month of lessons. Most students have to learn to feel music through their whole body. Alex already lives there. He's teaching me things about the physical nature of musical expression that I never understood after 20 years of conducting. Under Professor Gonzalez's guidance, Alex had developed a conducting technique that combined traditional gestures with adaptations that accommodated his unique way of perceiving musical information. He learned to use visual cues from musicians' body language and breathing patterns to anticipate musical events. He developed sensitivity to stage vibrations that allowed him to detect the precise moment when wind instruments entered or string sections changed dynamics. By age 13, Alex was guest conducting youth orchestras and chamber ensembles, creating performances that musicians later described as among the most emotionally connected and rhythmically precise they had ever experienced. His conducting style was distinctive, more physically expressive than traditional approaches, more focused on the corporeal aspects of musical communication that most conductors took for granted. But Alex had always dreamed of conducting a major orchestra, the kind of ensemble that creates music large enough and complex enough to fully utilize his extraordinary perceptual abilities. The problem was that professional orchestras were understandably hesitant to work with a deaf teenager, regardless of his demonstrated abilities with smaller ensembles. That's when Carmen had suggested America's Got Talent, not because Alex needed validation or celebrity, but because a national platform might demonstrate to the musical establishment that deaf conductors could bring unique perspectives and capabilities to classical music performance. The challenge was that Alex would be performing without an actual orchestra, conducting an ensemble that existed only in his imagination, and the audience's willingness to trust his interpretation of music. They couldn't hear him direct. Alex had spent months preparing for this moment, developing a piece he called Symphony of Silence, a conducting performance designed to demonstrate how music could be experienced and expressed through visual gesture, physical movement, and the kind of kinesthetic musical understanding that existed beyond the conventional boundaries of hearing. The stage manager approached him in the wings. "Alex, you're up." Alex nodded, adjusting his grip on the conductor's baton and taking a deep breath that helped him center his awareness in the vibrational sensitivities that had become his musical compass. He had practiced this moment countless times, but standing here in the wings of America's Got Talent, he realized that no amount of preparation could ready someone for the moment when you ask the world to trust that music exists beyond the limits of conventional perception. He walked onto the stage, carrying 16 years of learning to hear with his entire body, a baton that represented his bridge between silence and symphony, and the kind of courage that transforms what appears to be limitation into revolutionary artistic expression. The audience's reaction was immediately curious and supportive, applauding for someone who clearly belonged to the world of classical music. Alex moved with the distinctive bearing of a trained conductor, his posture and arm positioning immediately identifying him as someone with serious musical education. Simon leaned forward, his attention caught by something he couldn't immediately define. This contestant felt different from typical musical acts, more formal, more classical, carrying himself with a gravity that suggested significant training and purpose. "Hello," Simon said, his voice carrying clearly across the theater. "What's your name?" Alex looked directly at Simon, reading his lips with the precision that had become second nature over 16 years of navigating a hearing world. "My name is Alex Rivera," he said, his speech carrying the distinctive patterns of someone who had learned to speak without hearing his own voice, but with clarity that came from years of speech therapy and determination to communicate effectively. "And what are you going to do for us tonight, Alex?" Alex held up his conductor's baton, the gesture eloquent in its simplicity. "I'm going to conduct a symphony, but I should tell you something first. I was born completely deaf. I've never heard a single note of music in my entire life." The casual energy in the theater shifted immediately. Confused murmurs, questions whispered between audience members trying to understand how someone could conduct music they couldn't hear. "You're going to conduct," Simon said slowly, "but you can't hear music?" Alex smiled, an expression that carried both humility and confidence. "I can't hear music the way you hear it, but I can feel it in ways that might surprise you. Music isn't just sound, Mr. Cowell. It's vibration, rhythm, energy, movement. It's the way air moves when violins enter, the way floors vibrate when timpani play, the way musicians breathe together before a crescendo." Simon felt something shift in his chest, recognition that this audition was about to challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of musical experience. "How did you learn to conduct if you've never heard music?" one of the other judges asked gently. Alex's expression became more animated, more passionate. "I learned to feel music through my whole body. When I was little, my mother would take me to concerts and I would sit in the front row, not to see better, but to feel the vibrations through the floor, through my chair, through the air itself. I started noticing that different instruments create different patterns of vibration. I could feel when violins were playing versus when cellos were playing. I could sense when the music was getting louder or softer, faster or slower." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Most people think music enters through your ears, but it also enters through your skin, your bones, your chest cavity. I just learned to pay attention to those pathways that hearing people usually ignore." Simon was mesmerized. Here was someone describing a completely alternative relationship with music, a way of experiencing symphony that existed entirely outside conventional auditory perception. "And you're gonna demonstrate this for us how?" Simon asked. Alex gestured to the empty stage around him. "I'm going to conduct Beethoven's Symphony No. 9, the Ode to Joy. But you won't hear the orchestra because the orchestra is in my memory, in my body, in the vibrations I've felt from this piece hundreds of times. What you'll see is how music looks when someone feels it instead of hearing it." The statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything the audience thought they understood about musical performance. "You're going to conduct an invisible orchestra," Simon said, not as a question, but as an attempt to comprehend the magnitude of what Alex was proposing. "The orchestra isn't invisible to me," Alex replied. "I can feel every section, every instrument, every moment where they breathe together. I'm going to show you what Beethoven looks like when you experience him through vibration instead of sound." Simon nodded slowly, understanding that he was about to witness something unprecedented in his years of judging musical acts. "Whenever you're ready, Alex." Alex moved to the center of the stage, raised his baton, and closed his eyes. For a moment, He stood completely still, as if listening to something only he could perceive. Then he raised his arms in the classic, preparatory gesture that signals the beginning of a symphony. What happened next was unlike anything anyone in that theater had ever witnessed. Alex began conducting with the precision and passion of a master, his baton tracing patterns in the air that clearly corresponded to specific musical passages. His left hand shaped dynamics and phrasing with subtle gestures that showed deep understanding of orchestral balance. The audience was transfixed. They could see the music in Alex's movements, feel the rhythm in his precisely timed gestures, sense the emotional arc of Beethoven's symphony through the passionate intensity of his conducting. This wasn't pantomime or approximation. This was genuine musical interpretation happening entirely in the space between Alex's body and his extraordinary perception of vibrational memory. Simon found himself completely absorbed in watching someone conduct music that existed only in the performer's kinesthetic understanding. Alex's technique was flawless, his interpretation sophisticated, his emotional connection to the music absolutely authentic. As Alex reached the famous Ode to Joy section, his conducting became more expansive, more jubilant, his entire body expressing the universal celebration that defines Beethoven's final symphony. His face showed the same kind of transcendent expression that Simon had seen on the faces of the world's greatest conductors, completely lost in the experience of shaping musical expression. The audience began to hear the music through Alex's conducting, not audibly, but somehow through the visual communication of his gestures, the way his movements made Beethoven's rhythms and melodies visible in space and time. As Alex brought the symphony to its triumphant conclusion, his arms held high in the final gesture of musical completion, the silence that followed felt like the natural conclusion to an actual orchestral performance. The audience seemed unsure whether to applaud for music they hadn't heard, but had somehow experienced through Alex's extraordinary translation of Beethoven into visual form. Then, Simon did something that had never happened in the show's history. He stood up from the judges' table and began to applaud, not the polite applause of acknowledgement, but the sustained, emotional applause that recognizes genuine artistry. The rest of the judges followed, then the entire audience. But Simon wasn't finished. He walked around the judges' table and approached the stage, still applauding, his expression showing something close to awe. Alex opened his eyes and looked at Simon with surprise and hope, unsure whether the response he was seeing indicated success or confusion. Simon climbed onto the stage and approached Alex, stopping in front of the young conductor, who had just redefined everything Simon thought he knew about musical performance. "Alex," Simon said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want to tell you something." Alex waited, reading Simon's lips with intense concentration. "I have been in the music business for over 30 years, Simon said. "I have worked with the biggest orchestras in the world, heard the most famous conductors, witnessed every kind of musical performance imaginable." Alex listened, uncertain where this was heading. "What you just did," Simon continued, "was one of the most musical performances I have ever witnessed. Not despite your deafness, but because of the way your deafness has taught you to experience music in ways that hearing people never could." Simon turned to address the entire theater. This young man just proved that music isn't about hearing. It's about feeling, understanding, connecting with something larger than ourselves. Alex Rivera doesn't just conduct orchestras. He translates music into a language that transcends sound. Alex felt tears forming in his eyes, not from sadness, but from the recognition that someone understood what he had been trying to communicate through years of developing his unique relationship with musical expression. "You've never heard Beethoven," Simon said, "but you understand Beethoven in ways that most hearing musicians never will. You've taught us that music isn't something that happens to us. It's something we create through our willingness to feel it completely." Simon gestured to Alex's baton. "This isn't just a conducting tool. It's a bridge between different ways of experiencing the world. You've shown us that limitation can become innovation, that difference can become artistry." As the golden buzzer activated and confetti began falling around them, Simon offered Alex something unprecedented. His own hands positioned as if he were part of Alex's invisible orchestra, waiting for direction from someone who had just proven that the most profound musical communication happens not through sound, but through the shared understanding that music lives in movement, feeling, and the courage to conduct symphonies that exist only in the space between heartbeats. After the cameras stopped rolling, Simon spent time with Alex, learning more about his extraordinary journey from silence to symphony. "You know what moved me most about your performance?" Simon asked. "It wasn't the technical skill, though that was remarkable. It was watching you conduct with such joy, such passion. You weren't performing despite being deaf. You were celebrating a completely different way of being musical." Alex nodded, adjusting the baton that had become his voice in a world designed for ears rather than hearts. "I learned that music doesn't require hearing," Alex explained through the interpreter that Simon had arranged. "It requires listening. And listening can happen through any part of your body that's willing to pay attention." Simon realized he had learned something profound about the difference between hearing music and truly listening to it, about the ways that physical limitation could lead to expanded perception rather than diminished experience. 6 months later, Alex became the first deaf conductor to lead a major symphony orchestra in a performance that was broadcast internationally. The Los Angeles Philharmonic had invited him to conduct Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the same piece he had performed at his AGT audition. Standing on the podium at Walt Disney Concert Hall, Alex felt the vibrations of 90 musicians breathing together, their instruments creating patterns of air movement and floor vibration that told him everything he needed to know about tempo, balance, and the collective musical intention of the ensemble. The performance was flawless, but more importantly, it was revelatory. Musicians later described it as one of the most physically connected, rhythmically precise, and emotionally authentic performances of Beethoven they had ever experienced. Alex conducts from a place that most of us have forgotten how to access, the concertmaster told reporters afterward. "He reminds us that music lives in our bodies, not just our ears. Playing with him feels like remembering how to breathe with the music instead of just hearing it." The Alex Rivera Foundation was established to provide musical education for deaf and hard-of-hearing young people, based on the understanding that musical expression could take forms that transcended conventional auditory perception. The foundation's motto, taken from Alex's AGT audition, was simple: "Music lives where feeling meets intention." But perhaps most importantly, Alex had changed how the musical establishment understood the relationship between physical perception and artistic expression. Conservatories began incorporating vibrational awareness into their conducting programs. Professional orchestras started working with deaf consultants to understand how musical communication could be enhanced through non-auditory channels. The silent symphony that Alex had conducted on that AGT stage had become a new movement in classical music education and performance, proving that the most profound artistic innovations often come from artists who approach familiar territories through completely unfamiliar pathways. Alex still conducted with the same baton he had carried onto the AGT stage, but now it guided actual orchestras through performances that proved music could be felt, seen, and understood through pathways that existed far beyond the narrow channel of hearing. The young man who had never heard a single note of music had become a teacher for musicians who had never learned to feel music with their entire bodies, proving that sometimes the most beautiful symphonies are the ones that exist in the space between silence and sound, conducted by someone brave enough to trust that music lives wherever human hearts are willing to beat in rhythm with something larger than themselves. It wasn't just television that night, it was a masterclass in the universal language of music, a demonstration that rhythm transcends hearing, and proof that sometimes the most profound performances are conducted by those who have learned to hear with their hearts instead of their ears. The video of Alex's performance became more than viral content. It became a teaching tool used in conservatories worldwide. The footage was studied by musicologists and educators trying to understand how someone could develop such sophisticated musical understanding without ever experiencing auditory input. Dr. Michael Steinberg from the Juilliard School wrote in his analysis, Alex Rivera's conducting demonstrates that musical knowledge can develop through entirely non-auditory pathways. His understanding of orchestral balance, his sensitivity to rhythmic subtlety, these capabilities emerge through vibrational perception and kinesthetic intelligence that challenges our assumptions about musical education. Carmen Rivera watched the footage of her son's performance countless times, each viewing revealing new details about their journey from his silent childhood to international recognition. "I always knew Alex was musical," she told documentary filmmakers, "but I didn't understand that he was experiencing music in a completely different way from the rest of us. He wasn't trying to access our world of sound. He was creating his own world of musical feeling." 6 months later, Alex became the first deaf conductor to lead a major symphony orchestra. The Los Angeles Philharmonic had invited him to conduct Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the same piece he had performed at his AGT audition. Standing on the podium at Walt Disney Concert Hall, Alex felt the vibrations of 90 musicians breathing together, their instruments creating patterns of air movement that told him everything he needed to know about tempo, balance, and collective musical intention. The performance was flawless and revelatory. Musicians later described it as one of the most physically connected, rhythmically precise performances of Beethoven they had ever experienced. Alex conducts from a place that most of us have forgotten how to access. The concertmaster told reporters, "He reminds us that music lives in our bodies, not just our ears. Playing with him feels like remembering how to breathe with the music." The Alex Rivera Foundation was established to provide musical education for deaf and hard-of-hearing young people, based on the understanding that musical expression could transcend conventional auditory perception. The foundation's motto was simple: "Music lives where feeling meets intention." Professor Gonzalez, Alex's first conducting teacher, established the Rivera method at the conservatory, a conducting pedagogy that incorporated vibrational perception techniques into traditional musical training. Students learned to feel orchestral balance through their feet, to sense instrumental entries through changes in air pressure. "Alex taught us that we were only using a fraction of our musical perception," Professor Gonzalez explained. "Music exists in space, in movement, in the physical relationship between performers." Alex never lost that awareness because he never had hearing to rely on as a substitute for complete musical attention. Simon continued following Alex's career with personal investment, attending performances and supporting educational initiatives that grew from his AGT audition. "Alex changed my definition of talent," Simon said. During a speech at the Rivera Center's dedication, "I used to think talent was about having exceptional abilities. Alex taught me that talent is about using whatever abilities you have in ways that no one else has thought to explore." Alex's success inspired a generation of deaf musicians who had been told that professional musical careers were impossible. Conservatories began actively recruiting deaf students, understanding that their different perceptual approaches could contribute innovations to traditional musical practices. In his acceptance speech when he received the International Music Educator Award, Alex signed a message that was translated, "I never learned to conduct music despite being deaf. I learned to conduct music because I am deaf. My deafness isn't something I overcome to make music. It's the reason my music sounds different from everyone else's." The baton he had carried onto the AGT stage was eventually donated to the Smithsonian Institution. But Alex continued using an identical baton for his performances, maintaining the connection to that first moment when he had asked a television audience to trust that music could exist beyond the boundaries of hearing. Years later, when Alex was appointed as the first deaf conductor of a major international orchestra, he returned to America's Got Talent as a guest, performing the same Beethoven piece that had launched his career. This time, he conducted the AGT House Orchestra, real musicians playing actual instruments, creating sound that the audience could hear, while Alex guided them through his extraordinary translation of vibrational perception into orchestral leadership. The performance was a full-circle moment that demonstrated how far both Alex and the musical establishment had traveled since that first audition. The orchestra followed his conducting with precision and passion that proved musical communication truly was universal. The silent symphony had found its voice not through sound, but through the recognition that music lives wherever human beings are willing to feel rhythm, sense connection, and trust that the most profound artistic experiences happen in the space between heartbeats, guided by conductors brave enough to lead orchestras with their entire bodies rather than just their ears.